I arrived unexpectedly at the company's private dinner and saw the boss kiss my wife. The moment my eyes caught the scene, time seemed to slow down. A numbness spread through my body like an electric shock, burning my skin, freezing my muscles. The sound of cutlery clinking on plates, the muffled laughter of colleagues, the murmur of conversations around, everything dissolved into the background, becoming an insignificant noise. There, at the center of it all, was her. The woman I loved. The woman with whom I shared years of history, plans, moments, promises. The woman who now gave herself to another man with lips that were once only mine. My fingers curled into fists. The blood pounded against my skull, a dull, incessant pounding that rivaled the searing pain in my chest. I took a deep breath, trying to rationalize, find some explanation, some justification. Maybe I had seen it wrong. Maybe it was just a close conversation, a moment of banter, a misunderstanding. But it wasn't. It couldn't be. Her eyes were closed, her body was slightly inclined, her hand resting gently on his chest. There was no hesitation. There was no blame. There wasn't even a trace of doubt in the way he gave himself to that kiss. She wanted him. I felt a bitter taste rise in my throat. I swallowed hard, feeling the suffocating weight of betrayal spread like poison through my body. How did this happen? How did I not notice? I, who knew every detail of her, every expression, every nuance of her behavior, was the last to know. The idiot. The clown who maintained this farce without even suspecting it. The boss, the man who reached out to me when I first joined the company, the same man who shook my hand firmly during my last promotion, who called me his right-hand man, now had his tongue in my wife's mouth. The air in the room seemed thin. My vision, blurred by shock and anger, focused only on them. I could lunge, scream, punch him until my fist burned, until my pain became his pain. But no. It wouldn't be like that. That would be little. That would be what anyone would do. And I'm not just anyone. I took a deep breath and swallowed my anger, feeling the metallic taste of wounded pride. I could turn this moment into something bigger. Something they would never forget. How about exposing everything? How about making sure not just me, but everyone in that room, knew exactly who she was? Who was he? The respected, admired boss, the brilliant businessman, and the devoted wife, always so elegant, now exposed for what they really were, two unscrupulous, shameless, characterless traitors. I sat discreetly in a corner of the room, observing every detail. How did they behave? How did they act after the kiss? I looked at my wife, expecting a hint of guilt, a look around, perhaps trying to find myself among the guests. But she just smiled at him, leaning in slightly to whisper something in his ear. And that was it. Nothing more. No hesitation. No regrets. No conscience. I clutched the glass in my hands, feeling the cold glass against my skin, hot with fury. My heart raced at a frantic pace. What were the options? Should I confront them right then and there? Spill the wine over her and spit truths in their faces? Or should I wait, collect evidence, devise something grander, more definitive? She would never know what awaited her. Neither does he. Silence would be my weapon. I would let them believe they were in control, that they were not discovered. I would let them feel safe, free to continue their dirty little game. And when they least expected it, when they thought they were untouchable, I would unmask everything. I would destroy everything. Dinner followed, and I watched. I watched as she laughed at his jokes, as they exchanged complicit glances, as her body gently leaned towards him, in gestures that were previously only mine. Every second fueled the fury inside me, a cold, calculating anger, different from the initial outburst of hatred. It wasn't just betrayal. It was disrespect. Shame. The night progressed, and I planned. There would be a right moment, a way to transform this betrayal into an unforgettable spectacle. They made a fool of me. They played on my confidence. But I was not a man who allowed himself to be destroyed. I fought back. I always fought back. And then, something unexpected happened. Something that made my stomach sink even deeper, that made my skin tingle, that brought a new layer of horror to it all. Something I could never predict. Something that made everything even worse. And in that moment, I realized the truth was much darker than I imagined. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal is never romanticized or justified. Our stories are fictional, but the pain and consequences are real. The objective is clear: to show how betrayal destroys lives, corrodes relationships and leaves deep scars. Get ready for a shocking story, full of twists, intense emotions and an ending you will never forget. Take a deep breath, and let's get started. The clock on the wall of the spacious living room said almost 8 o'clock at night, and the smell of freshly prepared food still hung in the air. Lucas adjusted his tie in front of the living room mirror, his eyes examining his own reflection with some distraction. He always dressed well for important company events, but that night, something seemed different. Maybe it was the fact that he was more tired than usual, or maybe it was the uncomfortable feeling that had been growing in his chest for the last few weeks. Not that there was anything concrete to justify that concern. It was just an instinct, an inexplicable feeling that something in his life had subtly changed, without him knowing exactly what. Mariana appeared through the bedroom door, adjusting her silver earring that glittered in the yellow light from the lamp. Her navy blue dress hugged her curves just right, elegant without being exaggerated. The familiar scent mixed with the aroma of the wine that Lucas had opened moments before, creating an almost perfect atmosphere. They made an admirable couple, one of those who, to others, seemed to have everything under control. The 10-year marriage was seen as solid, stable, an example of complicity and mutual respect. The spacious house where they lived reflected this stability, with its well-chosen furniture and every detail meticulously planned. It was a home built with effort, dedication and, above all, love. Lucas had always been a dedicated man. He had worked at the same company for over 15 years and had earned his place with a lot of sweat. He started as a simple assistant and, over time, became a fundamental part of the company's growth. His boss, Gustavo, was an influential, charming and strategic man, one of those who knew exactly how to run a business and how to keep his employees motivated. Mariana had always admired him from a distance, but had never had close enough contact beyond formal interactions at corporate events. At least, that's what Lucas thought. Mariana, in turn, was an intelligent and independent woman. He had a stable job at an advertising agency and enjoyed what he did, although recently he felt a growing restlessness within himself. Their marriage was good, but, like any long-term relationship, it had moments of predictability. The conversations between her and Lucas were pleasant, but they often revolved around the same things: work, bills, future plans that never got off the ground. There was affection, there was respect, but there was also a routine that repeated itself like an unbreakable cycle. That night's dinner was an exclusive corporate event, a celebration among the company's closest directors and employees. A private meeting, without the formalities of major annual events, just a moment of celebration to strengthen ties. Lucas was eager to go, not only because of the opportunity to strengthen relationships with his superiors, but because he enjoyed these moments with Mariana. She always knew how to shine at social events, had a natural ease with conversation and a smile that made anyone feel welcome. And he, in a way, was proud of it. I liked seeing her interact, noticing how people admired her. It was a reflection of everything they had built together. During the car ride to the restaurant reserved for the event, Lucas noticed that Mariana seemed distracted. His eyes roamed the landscape through the window, and his smile, although present, seemed a little distant. He tried to start a conversation, asked about her day, about what had happened at work, but the answers were short, almost automatic. It wasn't the first time she acted like this, but, as she always did, he ignored the feeling and continued driving, convincing himself that it was just tiredness. The restaurant chosen for the evening was sophisticated, one of those places where the low lighting and refined decor created an intimate and elegant atmosphere. The tables were arranged in a reserved space, away from the main hall, guaranteeing the privacy of the guests. As soon as they arrived, they were warmly welcomed by Gustavo, who, as usual, exuded confidence and charm. He shook Lucas's hand tightly and then turned to Mariana, greeting her with a smile that seemed to last a second longer than necessary. Lucas noticed, but dismissed the idea, attributing it to his own momentary paranoia. Wine glasses began to fill and conversation flowed naturally among the guests. Mariana loosened up a little more as the night progressed, smiling more, interacting with her colleagues, and Lucas allowed himself to relax. He watched his wife from afar, feeling that silent pride in having her by his side. He knew that many people thought she was stunning, that she attracted glances wherever she went, but he had never been bothered by that. I trusted her. He had always trusted. The thought that something could be different had never really crossed his mind, just as one of those fleeting fears that arise and are soon discarded. Gustavo was the center of attention, as always. His magnetic manner made everyone feel at ease, and his stories were always engaging. He talked about travel, about business, about opportunities. There was a confidence in his tone that made people want to be close to him. Mariana seemed especially attentive, laughing at his jokes, leaning in slightly to hear him better. Lucas noticed these small gestures, but saw them as part of the normal dynamics of a lively conversation. After all, she had always been charismatic, she had always liked interacting with people. The dishes began to arrive, and Lucas allowed himself to enjoy the sophisticated food and full-bodied wine. He felt lighter, perhaps due to the effect of the alcohol, perhaps because he had finally convinced himself that his initial restlessness was nothing more than a reflection of the accumulated stress of the last few weeks. Mariana seemed more relaxed too, and the atmosphere around her was pleasant. It was a night like any other, an event like any other. At least, that's what he thought. The clock indicated that the night was already advancing, and many were beginning to say goodbye, preparing to leave. Lucas got up to get another glass of wine and spent a few minutes talking to one of his coworkers. When he returned, he noticed that Mariana was not at the table. His gaze swept around the room, looking for her, but she was not visible among the guests. It was then that his heart accelerated, for no apparent reason. A strange feeling settled in his chest, a weight he couldn't explain. He took a deep breath and walked through the restaurant, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something was wrong. And then, he turned into the hallway that led to a more private space. And he saw it. The image took a moment to process in his mind, but when it finally did, it was like a blow. Mariana was there. And she wasn't alone. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine when he turned the corner and saw Mariana there, in the private corner of the restaurant, away from the hustle and bustle of the guests. But what really made his stomach turn was not just her presence, but the way she was leaning in, too close to Gustavo. The soft ambient light cast shadows on the contours of the bodies, but there was no doubt about what he was seeing. The boss had one hand resting on Mariana's waist, while the other slid down her arm, in a touch that was too intimate to be mistaken for an innocent gesture. Lucas stopped midway, as if his own body couldn't believe what his eyes were registering. The ground seemed to disappear beneath his feet, and a buzzing sound filled his ears, drowning out any other sounds around him. Lucas's mind tried to find a logical explanation, a justification for that closeness. Maybe they were just talking and he was exaggerating. But then, Gustavo leaned in a little more and said something that made Mariana smile in a way Lucas hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't her usual smile, the one she gave when she was being polite. It was a genuine, seductive smile, filled with something he didn't want to name. The boss touched her face, brushing aside a strand of hair with a practiced gesture, and that was when Lucas felt the real impact of what was happening. This wasn't a slip-up, it wasn't an isolated moment. This was intimacy, something that only two people who share secrets and desires can have. Lucas took a step back, but his body was caught between the need to confront them right there and the irrational impulse to run away. Her heart was beating so hard she felt every pulse in her throat, and her stomach seemed to twist into tight knots. He always knew that Mariana was admired, that she attracted looks and compliments, but he never imagined that she would be capable of doing something like that. Not with him. Not after everything they've been through together. Every memory, every promise exchanged, every night shared now seemed like a sham built on sand, about to be swept away by the merciless tide of betrayal. The scene before him unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. Mariana raised her hand and touched Gustavo's chest in a subtle but intimate way. The boss laughed softly, leaning in even more, and that's when it happened. The kiss. It wasn't a stolen kiss, it wasn't a momentary mistake. It was a conscious kiss, full of desire, of something forbidden that was now materializing before Lucas' eyes. Time froze. The air became heavy. Something inside him broke into 1,000 irreparable pieces. He wanted to scream, he wanted to do something, but his body didn't react. It was as if he was paralyzed, condemned to watch his own marriage fall apart without being able to stop it. The bitter taste of contempt rose in his throat. Everything he believed to be solid now dissolved like fog before his eyes. Mariana pulled away from the kiss for a brief moment, and Lucas noticed the way she looked at Gustavo. There was no blame. There was no hesitation. There was familiarity, as if it had happened before, as if it was something that was repeated and that he, like a fool, had never noticed. The betrayal was not just in the act, but in the naturalness with which it happened. In the fact that his wife, the woman who was supposed to love him, saw nothing wrong with being in another man's arms. Lucas's stomach turned, but he remained still. His mind now worked in a cold, calculating way. He could explode right there, cause a scandal, go after Gustavo and make Mariana swallow every lie she had told. But something inside him told him that this was not enough. They didn't just deserve your anger. They deserved something bigger. Something that would make them never forget what they did. And then, with his fists clenched and his heart turned to stone, he made his decision. They didn't know they had been seen. They didn't know they were about to be unmasked in a way they never imagined. Lucas took a step back, feeling a new wave of adrenaline course through his body. He wasn't just going to react in the heat of the moment. No. He was going to plan. I was going to wait for the right moment to expose every detail, to make Mariana and Gustavo feel the weight of betrayal firsthand. The night was not over yet. And before it was over, they would know exactly who they were dealing with. Lucas held the wine glass tightly, feeling the tension pulse in his temples. Dinner was already in its final moments, and most of the guests had said goodbye, but he remained there, watching every movement, waiting for the right moment. Gustavo and Mariana were sitting side by side, easy smiles on their faces, engaged in a relaxed conversation, as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just destroyed everything he believed to be real. Lucas took a deep breath, swallowing the growing fury that threatened to boil over. It wouldn't be there, in the heat of the moment, that he would make his move. They deserved more. They deserved to feel the weight of their choices firsthand. They deserved to be exposed in the cruelest and most definitive way possible. The waiter approached, collecting empty plates and offering another round of drinks, but Lucas declined with a subtle wave. His gaze remained fixed on the boss and his wife, analyzing every detail, every gesture, every exchange of glances that, now, for him, overflowed with hidden meanings. How long had that been happening? How many times had he been deceived? How many nights had Mariana come home after being with Gustavo, lying next to him as if nothing was out of place? The thought made his skin burn, like he was being burned from the inside out. But he would not allow anger to consume him. Not yet. Gustavo raised his glass, toasting something that Lucas didn't even hear. Mariana smiled, her eyes shining in the restaurant's soft lighting. It was the same expression she used to have when they were alone, the same one that made Lucas feel like he was the only man in the world for her. But now, looking from the outside, he saw the lie. I saw the well-rehearsed theater, the mask she wore so naturally that it was scary. How did you not notice before? How could you be so blind? Lucas leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. His voice was low, controlled, but filled with something that made Mariana look away from Gustavo and look at him with a hint of hesitation. He smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and let the first piece of his game fall onto the table. Silence fell for a few seconds, and he watched the way her breathing became shorter, the way the smile on her lips trembled for a moment before she tried to regain her composure. Gustavo arched his eyebrow, the usual unshakable confidence reflected on his face. He didn't know he was treading on dangerous ground. I had no idea what was about to happen. Lucas leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he watched Mariana try to hide the discomfort that was quickly setting in. The woman who had previously seemed so confident now seemed tense. The clock in the restaurant was almost midnight, and the place was emptying out. The timing was perfect. Lucas slid his cell phone across the tabletop, stopping right in front of Gustavo and Mariana. The two looked at the object with confusion before he added the final touch, a video. Mariana's eyes widened. Gustavo, for a brief moment, seemed to lose his color. The image began to rotate, and the betrayal unfolded there, in front of their own faces. The kiss. The touch. The obvious complicity. The silence that followed was heavy, dense, suffocating. Mariana put a hand to her mouth, shock written all over her expression. Gustavo, on the other hand, adopted a defensive posture, his eyes darkening with something that could be anger or nervousness. But Lucas didn't care anymore. There was no room for regrets or empty apologies. Mariana tried to speak, but Lucas raised his hand, interrupting her before any words could come out of her mouth. He didn't want to hear justifications. I didn't want explanations. Nothing she said would change the fact that she destroyed everything they had. He stood up, sliding his hands into his pockets, feeling the weight of his car keys, the cold of the metal against his fingers. Mariana tried to get closer, touch him, but he moved away, refusing any contact. Gustavo adjusted his posture, trying to regain his composure, but there was something in his gaze that indicated he knew he was at a disadvantage. Lucas laughed quietly, a humorless, lifeless laugh. He looked at Mariana one last time, and this time, he only saw a stranger. There was no more love there. There was no more pain. Just an absolute emptiness, a definitive end. Lucas took his cell phone back and walked to the exit of the restaurant. His chest rose and fell in a heavy rhythm, but there was no hesitation in his steps. Mariana and Gustavo remained behind, motionless, trapped in their own traps. They didn't know, but that wasn't the end yet. Not for them. For Lucas, yes. He was ready to move on. But them? They hadn't yet felt even half the weight of what they had done. And very soon, they would feel it. Lucas left the restaurant with firm steps, but his chest was still pulsing with contained fury. The cool night air didn't ease the tension in his shoulders, nor did it make him forget the bitter taste building up in his mouth. The silence outside contrasted brutally with the whirlwind of emotions inside. His gaze was lost for a moment in the city lights, trying to find some semblance of rationality in the midst of the chaos that had just collapsed on his life. But there wasn't. All that existed was a distorted reality, built on lies, stolen kisses and broken vows of love. The sound of hurried heels against the asphalt cut through the silence. He didn't need to turn around to know it was Mariana. Her perfume betrayed her presence before she even opened her mouth. But he didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to hear his voice filled with belated regret, nor his empty justifications. He had already seen everything he needed to see. He had already felt the pain eat away at every part of his being, and now there was only emptiness. Mariana stopped a few steps away from him, her breathing quickened, her eyes wide with urgency. Her makeup, flawless earlier in the evening, was now slightly smudged. The half-open lips trembled, as if searching for words that could erase what had been exposed, but there were no words for that. She tried to touch his arm, but Lucas recoiled, as if the simple contact was enough to burn him. His gaze met hers, and for a moment, only silence came between them. A heavy silence, filled with everything that didn't need to be said. Lucas let out a short, dry laugh, without any humor. He ran a hand over his face, trying to contain the exhaustion that was now mixing with his anger. Finally, he looked up at Mariana and his voice was low, but sharp. Mariana blinked rapidly, as if in a failed attempt to dispel the tears that were accumulating. But he was unmoved. She stared at him for a few seconds, her lips opening and closing without a sound coming out, as if she were in silent desperation. Until finally, his voice broke. Lucas felt his stomach turn. He shook his head, letting out a long, tired sigh. His eyes fixed on her with a coldness he himself didn't know he possessed. Mariana hesitated, swallowing hard. She bit her lip, and then, on impulse, grabbed his hands, squeezing tightly, as if she could hold him there with just that touch. His voice was almost a whisper, but carried with something that Lucas still didn't fully understand. Time seemed to stop. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. His mind, already exhausted by the betrayal, was now faced with an even more devastating truth. His fingers released hers, slowly, as if the weight of that revelation had paralyzed him. He blinked, trying to process the words he had just heard. A tight lump formed in his throat, and his breathing became shallow. Mariana covered her face with her hands, choking back a sob. His body shook, and for the first time that night, Lucas saw something other than guilt. He saw fear. He saw despair. Something that went beyond the fear of losing a wedding or being discovered. It was something deeper. Something that, somehow, had not yet been fully revealed. Lucas felt like he was standing over an abyss, staring at a precipice that he didn't know where it ended. He wanted to ask, wanted to demand more answers, but the words wouldn't come out. All he could feel was the pain of being deceived and now a new layer of anguish that he couldn't even name. The silence between them stretched, suffocating. Mariana was still shaking, her eyes fixed on his, begging for something he didn't know if he was still capable of giving. And then, in that moment, Lucas realized that the betrayal he had just discovered was just one part of something much bigger. Something that, until then, remained hidden in the shadows. And he needed to know. I needed to understand. Because now, it wasn't just about a broken marriage. It was a truth that could change everything. Lucas stood there, motionless, as if he had been struck by a blow that left him breathless. Mariana's words still echoed in her mind, mixed with the images of the betrayal she had just witnessed. Everything seemed to coalesce into an indistinct blur of anger, hurt, and growing discomfort. His eyes remained fixed on hers, searching for some explanation that could make it less absurd, less painful. But there was nothing. Just the suffocating silence between the two and the cold of the night that seemed increasingly icy. He took a deep breath, trying to gather the pieces of his sanity together before speaking, but each attempt only resulted in more questions. Mariana pressed her hands against her chest, her body trembled, but Lucas could no longer see that as a request for forgiveness. He didn't know what to think anymore, he didn't know what to feel anymore. Everything was fragmented, confused. It was as if, suddenly, the reality around him had shattered into 1,000 pieces and he was unable to put any of them back together. He blinked slowly, trying to process it, trying to understand how this fit into his life, how this secret had been kept hidden for so long. Gustavo, who until then had remained silent, finally took a step forward. His look was no longer that of a confident and confident man, but rather that of someone who knew he had crossed the line. His voice sounded tense, filled with a hesitation that was unusual for him. Lucas narrowed his eyes, feeling his blood boil when he heard that voice. He didn't want to hear explanations, he didn't want justifications. But at the same time, I knew I needed to listen. I needed to understand what was happening, even if it meant diving even deeper into the abyss of betrayal and lies. Mariana turned to Lucas, her desperate eyes searching his, as if there was still something there that could save her. But Lucas wasn't ready to save her. He didn't know if he wanted to anymore. He just waited, because for the first time that night, he didn't know what to do. The truth fell on him like an avalanche, dragging with it any shred of certainty he still had. He felt his stomach sink, his chest tighten. Everything he knew, everything he thought was his life, now turned out to be an even bigger lie than he could have imagined. His eyes fixed on Mariana, trying to find some answer, but all he found was guilt, regret and fear. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, trying to contain the explosion of emotions that threatened to escape from within him. But it was impossible. He opened his eyes again and his voice was low, but filled with something he himself didn't recognize. Mariana tried to get closer, but he took a step back, as if her very touch was poisonous. Gustavo observed the scene in silence, not daring to interrupt. Lucas shook his head, laughing bitterly, feeling like nothing made sense anymore. The anger gave way to a deep tiredness, as if the entire weight of the world had fallen on him at once. He ran his hands over his face, trying to organize his thoughts, but there was no logic, no explanation that made it bearable. He felt lost, as if he were adrift in an ocean of lies, not knowing where to swim. Mariana was still there, waiting for something. Waiting for him to say everything would be okay, that they would find a way to get through this. But Lucas knew there was no way to overcome that. Not after all. Not after discovering that her entire life had been built on something so fragile and brittle. Little by little, the anger dissipated, giving way to an overwhelming coldness. He finally knew what he needed to do. There was no more room for hesitation, for doubts. He faced Mariana one last time, allowing himself to record that moment, that expression of panic and regret, and then turned away, leaving her behind. His heart pounded heavily in his chest, but he didn't look back. There was nothing left there for him. And as he walked away from that night that destroyed his life, he felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was finally free. But the question was, free for what? Lucas walked aimlessly through the lit streets, feeling the coldness of the wind cut into his skin, but nothing seemed real. Each step seemed to drag him into a vortex of incessant thoughts, where the images of Mariana and Gustavo repeated themselves like a broken film, running endlessly in his mind. Confusion, anger, and emptiness were a toxic mix that gnawed at every fiber of his being. He tried to convince himself that there was still something to be saved, but deep down he knew the truth. There was nothing else there. The past he believed he knew had been ripped from his hands, revealing a cruel reality he had never suspected. His phone vibrated in his pocket, but he ignored it. I knew it was Mariana. He knew she would try to find him, say something that would ease the destruction she had caused. But there were no words that could fix what was broken. He continued walking, feeling the weight of the night intensify around him. He didn't want to go home, he didn't want to face this space that once meant comfort and now was just a reminder of how much he had been deceived. His feet carried him away, without a certain destination, but his mind forced him to relive every detail of what he had heard that night. The secret that Mariana had revealed still echoed in her head, leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. Hours passed and, when he finally realized, he was in front of the building where he worked. The office lights were still on Gustavo's floor. The world was spinning around Lucas, but his mind was fixed on one thing: he needed answers. Without hesitation, he entered the building, his footsteps echoing through the silent hallways. Each step seemed to carry a weight that increased with each second, and when the door to Gustavo's room opened, he already knew that he would not leave without confronting him. Gustavo looked up from the computer, clearly surprised to see him. For a moment, he tried to disguise it, recomposing his posture as if he still had control of the situation. But Lucas didn't leave room for games. His gaze was sharp, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. Gustavo leaned back in his chair, assessing him, trying to gauge how much danger was in front of him. Lucas crossed his arms, eyes fixed on the man in front of him. The silence was broken by Gustavo's ironic voice, but Lucas didn't react immediately. His body was rigid, as if he held within himself a whirlwind ready to explode. Gustavo sighed, running his hands over his face before looking at him again. Lucas felt his blood boil when he heard that evasive answer. He slammed his hand on the table hard, causing some papers to scatter. Gustavo blinked, surprised, but wasn't intimidated. Gustavo's gaze hardened, and for a moment he hesitated, as if considering whether it was worth continuing to play or finally telling the truth. Then he leaned forward, fingers interlaced on the table. Lucas felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a silent conspiracy that had been unfolding for much longer than he imagined. Everything he thought he controlled, everything he built, now appeared fragile, vulnerable to the will of a man who played with other people's lives without any hesitation. Gustavo's short, dry laugh resounded throughout the room, full of disdain. Lucas clenched his fists, feeling the bitter taste of truth dissolve in his mouth. He thought he was in control, that he could deal with the betrayal and move on, but now he saw that the web of lies was even bigger than he imagined. Mariana was not just an accomplice in betrayal. She was part of something much bigger, something that involved not just a man's broken heart, but the game of power and manipulation that Gustavo always knew how to play so well. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of revelation take over every cell in his body. Now he understood. Now everything made sense. Mariana's betrayal was not an accident, it was not a moment of weakness. It was a calculation, a conscious choice she made long before that night. And Lucas, naive, blinded by love and trust, was just a piece in their game. The crushing reality of that realization hit him like a blow. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking it all in. When he opened it again, his gaze was cold, without any trace of pain. He wouldn't waste another second on that. Not with Gustavo, not with Mariana, not with the past that he now buried forever. Lucas turned and left without saying anything else. The door closed behind him with a bang, but Gustavo didn't move. He just smiled, satisfied. But he didn't know. He didn't know that, at that moment, Lucas was already planning something that would change everything. Lucas didn't come home that night. He drove aimlessly for hours, feeling the crushing weight of the revelations that still echoed in his mind. Mariana's betrayal had already been a deep wound, but now, knowing that she was involved in something much bigger, in a dirty and calculated game, made everything even worse. The trust that once sustained their marriage was now just ashes. Nothing could change the fact that the woman he loved had chosen to betray him not just with another man, but with her own dignity, with everything they had once built together. The silence of the early morning was his only companion as he reflected on every detail, every lie, every moment that now seemed false. He no longer felt anger, nor despair. There was just an immense void, an abyss of indifference taking the place where love once existed. But he wouldn't let it destroy him. I wouldn't allow Mariana and Gustavo to go unharmed after everything they did. They needed to feel the weight of their choices firsthand, the same way he felt when he discovered the truth. The next day, Lucas already had everything planned. He wouldn't do anything impulsive, wouldn't explode into a rage as they might have expected. His revenge would be precise, calculated and definitive. He gathered evidence, emails, financial records and everything that could destroy Gustavo from the inside out. The boss's illicit dealings, the frauds he committed with the company's money, and the favors he offered to certain clients under the table were documented and sent to the correct departments. The media would soon pick up on the case and turn Gustavo's reputation into dust. But he saved the final blow for Mariana. She would lose everything. His name would be associated with Gustavo when the scandals came to light. And Lucas would make sure she knew he was the one who did it. At the end of the afternoon, he found her at home, and for the first time, he felt like a stranger in that place. The environment that once carried memories of love and complicity now seemed like a scene of betrayal and falsehood. Mariana was sitting on the sofa, her eyes red, her hands clasped on her knees. When he entered, she got up quickly, as if there was still something to be saved. Lucas just smiled sideways, an empty smile, without any affection. Mariana opened her mouth to speak, but he raised his hand, cutting off any attempt at justification. He didn't want to hear it, he didn't need an apology. The time for explanations was over. Her silence, for the first time, was louder than any words could be. The house, which had once been a home, was now nothing more than an empty space. Lucas knew he wouldn't go back there after that moment. His lawyer was already handling the divorce, and within a few weeks, everything would be resolved. He would take nothing more than his dignity, his freedom and the certainty that he would never be deceived like that again. Mariana felt the weight of the destruction she herself caused. When Lucas walked out the door, she knew this was the end. Not just from marriage, but from the life she knew. Her image was tarnished, her reputation ruined, and she knew she couldn't escape the consequences of her choices. Gustavo, in turn, faced the collapse of his empire. In a few days, everything he built collapsed. Accusations began to emerge, the police and the media were quick to expose every detail of his crimes. His influence disappeared, his arrogance was replaced by despair. He tried to reverse the situation, tried to blame others, but nothing worked. He was finished. Meanwhile, Lucas started his life again far from that past. He found strength where he thought there was none. He discovered that, despite the pain, there was still something new waiting for him. Someone new waiting for you. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Betrayal destroyed everything he knew, but in the end, it was what set him free. And now, it's up to you. What did you think of this story? Leave your comment below and share your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Here, betrayal is never romanticized, and our goal is to show how it can destroy lives. Thank you for following this far. Until next time.